Radical Spirits, Spiritualism, and Women's Rights in 19th-Century America by Braude. Continuing in Chapter 5, where I left off. After a 5-minute break, I'm back. Or whatever it was, 4 or 5 minute break. It's not easy to read 26 straight pages, so break it up, take a rest, all that shit. What the hell happened there? Get this bottle out of the way. Looks not classy. Control V. Number 11 is this. And then this is Chapter 5, Part 2. This is going to be longer than the other part, but I could do it. I'm not going to be able to read tomorrow morning, so since I got to go to work early. And that's that. All right, let's put this on, put a picture up, and start this motherfucking chat. Radical Spirits by Braude. Change. Radical. Save. Let's do this. Open the chat. Let's do it. Is this one 10? This one's 11, right? Right? Yeah. We are live, bruv. Do need something to weigh this down. Hold on. I have just the fucking answer. This heavy ass thing. Ugh. All right. Found something heavy to hold this. Hold your horses, buddy. See if this will do it. Nope, it's still not heavy enough. The only way to stop this book is to break the spine. Love. While spiritualists disagreed about whether marriage was morally salvageable, their agreement on the immortality of marriage, as practiced in mid-century America, led to the charge that they advocated free love. Free love is a problematic term for the historian because it was more frequently an accusation leveled at others than a positive self-identification. Generally understood to mean opposition to marriage as an institution, many who applied the label to themselves fell far short of this extreme position. Proponents used it to refer to their opposition to marriage laws that discriminated against women, while detractors used it as a synonym for promiscuity or infidelity. Hello, Bobs. Oh, I just tipped it over. This thing ain't gonna help me. You gotta go, ship. The ship go. To the term communist in 20th century America. Let's go back and read that. While detractors used it as a synonym for promiscuity or infidelity, similar to the term communist in 20th century America, free love often denoted a basic undermining of accepted values. Support for marriage as an institution became a litmus test by which conservatives, the New York Times, e.g., judged the morality of reformers. Those wary of radicals classed spiritualists, socialists, and women's rights advocates together as sympathizers with the boogeyman of radicalism, free love. The accusation of free love was a common weapon in the arsenal of spiritualism's enemies. John Ellis, who dedicated his 500-page expose of free love to the advocates of Christian marriage, concluded that approximately 4 million spiritualists in the United States were all more or less committed to the doctrine of free love. He charged that even though he does not practice it, the spiritualist is bound to uphold the doctrine since it is part of the peculiar creed. The suspicious public who feared free love believed that it threatened the family and the structure of society. While the term free love was infamous in mid-century America, the actual doctrines advocated by its adherents were usually quite tame. Free love in the 19th century did not imply the principle of sexual permissiveness that the phrase suggests to the 20th century reader. Rather, it referred to the belief that the morality of sexual intercourse depended on freely experienced compelling mutual desire, that is, love, not on whether the parties were married. It applied strict tests of morality to all sexual relations, whether within or without lawful marriage. Far from advocating casual or frequent sexual contacts, free lovers concurred with other health reformers that Americans had far too much sex, most of it within marriage. Vivian Gray wrote to the social revolutionists that sexual slavery in marriage destroyed the health of American women because submitting to sex without love was physically debilitating. Following the advice of spiritualist free love theorist Thomas Lowe Nichols, would result in a married couple having intercourse only as often as they had children, because the conjugal rights described by marriage laws were generally understood to guarantee a man's sexual access to his wife rather than a woman's sexual access to her husband. Free love meant the freedom of women to refuse their husbands' sexual advances, a potentially powerful source of autonomy in an age without contraception and with little notion of sexual satisfaction for women. Spiritualist free love advocates advanced the controversial doctrine as one aspect of woman's emancipation, as a remedy for abusive marriages. Where woman is degraded by a drunkard or a sensualist's rule, let her make herself free, advised the popular spiritualist writer. In keeping with their anarchist tendencies, spiritualists believed that state sanction could not impute morality to a sexual relation. Only lovers brought together by God-given natural impulses acted morally. If husband and wife ceased to feel true love for each other, they should cease sexual contact and live as brother and sister. Free love proponents called for liberalized divorce laws because they believed that if spouses did not love each other, sexual contact became immoral, even within a lawful marriage. Most spiritualists did not support free love, but most free love advocates were spiritualists. So the movements were widely linked in the popular mind. Notably, figures such as Mary Gove Nichols and Victoria Woodhull espoused spiritualism during their brief phases as free love activists, although they later recanted their unorthodox stands on both sex and religion. This radical minority benefited from spiritualists' commitment to free speech and expressed its position as a consistent application of the family concept of individual sovereignty. When a speaker at a New York State convention claimed that spiritualism had nothing to do with free love, abolition, or women's rights, agitator-editor Mrs. H.M.F. Brown asked, "What has it to do with anything if it ignores the discussion of the three great questions of the day?" Bombo clot. Brilliant. Radical spiritualists agreed that spiritualism had everything to do with these three movements, and all for the same reason. Free love, abolition, and women's rights all sought to liberate the individual from physical and spiritual domination by others and from the oppressive power of the state. Each movement spelled out one set of results of the consistent application of the principle of individual sovereignty. Book name is Radical Spirits, Spiritualism, and Women's Rights in 19th-Century America by Anne Braude. Each movement spelled out one set of results of the consistent application of the principle of individual sovereignty. Spiritualist socialist Alfred Cridge argued the philosophy of spirit existence clearly demonstrates the necessity of freedom in all relations to spiritual progress, because he believed that the sexual, conjugal, and parental relations were the most important that human beings can sustain to each other. He viewed complete freedom as especially important in these areas. Cridge argued that discordant social relations operate to attract low spirits because the spouse who attained a high level of spiritual development would be exposed to the spirits attracted by the spouse at a lower level. Mediums in particular could suffer from the influence of low spirits attracted by a spouse. Spiritual progress, Cridge concluded, depended on two conditions that could be created only by the practice of free love. First, power to dissolve all uncongenial and false relations, to individualize and disintegrate ourselves from the incongruous mass to which we are held, not by inward attraction, but by the outward focus of law and physical necessity. This constitutes the elements of individual sovereignty or freedom. The second step is to cooperate, to follow our attractions, to form true business and domestic relations, or in other words, to love. Thus we obtain the elements of freedom and love, forming in combination free love. This then being the essence of spiritual progress, free love is the doctrine of spiritualism. Cridge had been identified by a historian of free love as an opponent of the movement because he believed that marriage was the symptom, not the cause of social oppression. Yet he clearly advocates free love in this passage. During the 1850s, a surprising array of spiritualists accepted the label free lover without rejecting marriage as an institution. Only a handful of extremists wanted to abolish marriage altogether, while many spiritualists accepted a definition of free love that respected marriage and proposed to elevate it to a higher level. In fact, far from avoiding marriage, advocates of free love engaged in it more frequently than those who waited until parted by death to marry again. They believe that marriages should be easier to terminate, not more difficult to contract. They advocated free love because they wanted to free marriage from the debasing interference of the state and a pecuniary interest. They did not want to abolish it. Spiritualists Thomas and Mary Gove Nichols, Alfred and Annie Denton Cridge, and Lois Wastebrooker advocated free love because they viewed marriage as a sacred institution and believed that false marriages were immoral and should be more easily dissolved. An exchange regarding marriage and individual sovereignty in the Vanguard directly addressed the question of whether marriage was the cause or the symptom of women's oppression. John Patterson, editor of the Vanguard's predecessor, The Social Revolutionists, criticized editors Alfred and Anne Denton Cridge for being unfaithful to individualist principles by being married. According to Patterson, marriage, including the Cridge marriage, was incompatible with the individual sovereignty of women. Alfred Cridge replied that the problem lay with the oppression of women, not with the institution of marriage. Cridge appealed to both individual and social reform as solutions to women's disabilities rather than to the abolition of marriage. He attributed the oppression of women in marriage to the low level of development of the particular spouses, not to the institution of marriage. He cited himself and his wife as evidence for the compatibility of matrimony with self-sovereignty in the case of enlightened individuals, and hence we infer for others who are developed above the sphere of despotism and congenially mated. Cridge asserted that those who had not attained his own level of individual development will be despotic in any relation. To alleviate the disabilities suffered by married women, Cridge prescribed women's rights. When woman has her rights, her slavery is annihilated, not her marriage. Woman is deprived of her rights because she is a woman, not because she is married. Patterson retorted that women could never be free within marriage. He compared granting rights to women within marriage to alleviating the conditions of slaves without abolishing slavery. Any rights a woman gains within marriage are at the whim of her husband. Patterson's position was the more accurate portrayal of the law. Single women lost many rights with their legal death on marriage. They lost the rights to own property, to enter into contracts, and to conduct business without the consent of their husbands, not because they were women, but because they were married. That frickin' thing. Anne Denton Cridge also disagreed with Patterson's condemnation of her marriage, but on different grounds from her husband. She agreed that marriage had restricted her freedom because it had resulted in the birth of a child. However, she argued that marriage had also freed her because she wanted the child, and marriage gave her the opportunity to have one. This intimate journalistic meeting of the personal and the political ended abruptly with the unexpected death of the Cridge baby. Discussion of the morality of the Cridge marriage gave way to expositions of parental grief in the pages of the Vanguard. Anne Denton Cridge wanted self-sovereignty, but she also wanted the family, and knew by experience that the latter goal might require some compromise of the first. Spiritualists who advocated free love in addition to marriage, rather than as an alternative, recognized the potential victimization of women in the context of sexual freedom. Transient alliances might deprive women of the opportunity to have children or leave them unable to support their offspring. By attacking women's disabilities within marriage while simultaneously elevating the idea of marriage as a spiritual union, spiritualists hope to free women from threats to their autonomy, both in marriage and outside it. Newspaper editor Mrs. H.M.F. Braude illustrates free love proponent support for marriage. A longtime advocate of free love, she sought a license to perform weddings from the state of Illinois. As a representative of the Religio-Philosophical Society, she received the license and officiated at spiritualist weddings. When a young couple came forward and asked to be married at the annual festival of the Religio-Philosophical Society in 1865, Mrs. Braude obliged. She dealt some severe blows against the marriage laws, detailing the numerous legal disabilities to which marriage exposed women. She pled for the equality of wife and husband before the law, as they are before God. Braude censured parents who suffered their children to rush blindly to the marriage altar, condemning mothers and fathers who sell their beautiful, innocent daughters for homes of maintenance and positions. In her final rhetorical flourish, Mrs. Braude concluded that false marriages were the root cause of all the heartaches, the suicides, the jealousies, elopements, insanity, drunkenness, and, in fact, all the ills and curses that call for prisons, asylums, doctors, and preachers. Braude followed this bitter indictment of the marriage laws with a glowing description of the peace, God will, and holy aspirations, goodwill, that is, not God will, produced by true soul unions. She reminded the bride and groom that wedded hearts had no need of legislation to keep them together. They were bound by natural, by eternal laws, and would not disunite. After further remarks, Mrs. Braude performed the marriage in a ceremony similar to the Quaker rite. She directed the couple to link right hands in recognition that your hearts are already united and that you only ask public recognition of the marriage already registered in heaven. She then pronounced them husband and wife. Each week, the Religio-Philosophical Journal reported the names of couples committed to free love principles by participating in this unusual rite. Spiritualists turned the meaning of the marriage ceremony on its head by making it an occasion for the declaration of woman's freedom rather than her subjugation. The rejection of marriage was more characteristic of communitarian movements led by charismatic male mediums than of free love as expressed by independent spiritualists. Free love was most closely identified. I'm going to look how many pages are left. 141, so basically 8 pages. With John Murray Spears' Kiantone community in upstate New York, with the non-spiritualist Oneida community inspired and governed by John Humphrey Noyce, with the activities of Stephen Pearl Andrews and Thomas and Mary Gove Nichols at Josiah Warren's Modern Times on Long Island, and with the socialist Berlin Heights community in Ohio. These experiments made temporary alliances viable because the community replaced the couple as the source of permanent care for children. Mary Gove Nichols saw the cooperative economic and social arrangements of modern times as offering a new future for women. In order for women to realize health and freedom, purity and happiness, she argued, they must be self-supporting. So long as man feeds, he must control. Modern times propose cooperative nursery, laundry, and cooking facilities to ensure women's freedom and to provide for the inhabitants' material needs. Yet, with all the material objections to transient relationships answered, Nichols still considered marriage a sacrament, which could not be made by law. If any should wish to separate and form new unions, I doubt not they will do so, and not live in falsehood and discord. Still, she observed that most of modern times were loyal husbands and wives because they preferred to be. In the long run, utopian free love communities proved too short-lived to fulfill their promise to provide women with an alternative to marriage for the raising of children. When communities practice free love, as understood by the general public, few spiritualists condone the situation. Even the radical Elmer Loudon, who found so much about free love attractive, was repelled by a visit to the Berlin Heights community and professed himself perfectly content to let them wallow in their licentiousness. At the Rutland Free Convention, infamous for its free love debates, the medium, Mrs. Julia Branch, presented the anti-marriage position. It is woman's privilege to accept or refuse, claimed Mrs. Branch, and when her love has died out, she is no longer a fit partner for the man who has taken her to his heart. She proposed to substitute a resolution stating that the slavery and degradation of woman proceeds from the institution of marriage, for the more moderate resolution on egalitarian marriage adopted by the predominantly spiritualist convention. But Branch backed down when pressed as to whether she wished to be interpreted as advocating the exercise of male lust unrestrained, a result that more spiritualists viewed as inevitable if marriage was abolished altogether. Whereas a few were willing to advocate sexual relations outside marriage, very few were willing to put their views into practice, or at least to do so openly. Even varietist free lovers who believed that true love could occur with more than one person in a lifetime never advocated promiscuity. Spiritualist author and lecturer Moses Hall announced his free love views in 1873, In Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, he believed that people needed changes of sex partners just as they needed changes of scenery. His wife concurred, and they dissolved their marriage by mutual proclamation. Hall soon announced his free marriage to his lecture partner, Maddie Sawyer. They considered their union to be a marriage, although contracted without benefit of judge or clergy. Likewise, spiritualist Leo Miller and Maddie Strickland entered into a notorious free union in 1876 because they believed that they were spiritual affinities, not because they sought a temporary sexual relation. Because the term free love had no clear definition, reformers often said that they accepted free love if it meant one thing, but not if it meant another. The meaning of the term differed depending on whether it was being used as an accusation or a description. There are two meanings of free love, one high and holy, another low, debased, meaning free lust, said trans speaker Lizzie Doughton. She attributed the latter meaning to misguided male spiritualists. The man with a badly regulated love principle will go to a woman and let her know that a sentiment of affinity draws him toward her, and they charge this self-delusion to spiritualism. Distrust the spiritualism that says it is so. While Doughton did not deny the doctrine of affinity, she asserted that a properly regulated love principle will not entertain the idea of possession of another man's wife. She was prepared to support free love so long as it did not compromise marriage. Trans speaker Axa Sprague, on the other hand, decried marriage but refused the label free love. "You decidedly misunderstand me," she wrote to a newspaper to correct the impression that she taught free love. "I only spoke against the injustice of all laws, the laws of marriage among them," Sprague declared in an explanation that would have confirmed to many that she did in fact advocate free love. "Free love, as I accept it, is to love in my Father's world all that is lovable, admirable, and good," wrote Cora Wilburn. Wilburn, a social conservative known for her sentimental fiction and poetry, viewed free love as a stand against all oppression. "I protest against all forms of slavery, against the sale of my black brother and sister, against the education and sale of maidens from the marriage altar, against the tyranny of labor as it is enjoyed in our northern cities, in our factories, in our households, the hard-heartedness of landlords, the tasking of the wretched seamstress, the burdening of orphans and widows with the double weight of humiliation and toil, the starvation wages that force young women into the paths of degradation." Wilburn hoped that free love would eradicate the saddest captivity of all by bringing release from the dominion of the senses. Liberty from the bondage of all passions, the resurrection of the soul life of love and freedom from the environments of gross, debasing sensualism. While Wilburn understood the absence of sexual desire as freedom, others might interpret it as repression, the antithesis of spiritualist individualism. Wilburn's interpretation of free love clarifies how the espousal of the infamous doctrine could be part of the assertion of a conservative domestic ideology. Woman's mission in this age is with the spiritual faculties, Wilburn claimed. She has been long even as the beast of burden. She had been the unholy idol, the fashionable goddess. She must become the true woman, the pure angel, now. Spiritualist free love proponents clearly did not intend to increase men's sexual access to women or to condone sex outside marriage. They condemned the betrayer of innocence who seduces a young girl on a promise of marriage and then disappears, leaving her a victim of the double standard. Spiritualists showed their sympathy to victims of male lust in their response to the much publicized divorce suit of the young medium Cora Hatch. The 17-year-old trans speaker convinced the New York court to grant her a divorce because her husband and manager, Benjamin Hatch, took advantage of her youth to abuse her both financially and sexually. Benjamin Hatch responded with a pamphlet titled Spiritualist iniquities unmasked, which attributed the breakup of his marriage to his wife's mediumship. He accepted the reality of spirit communications, but claimed that mediumship always led to marital discord because only the lowest class of spirits remained close enough to Earth to influence mediums. He accused mediums generally of infidelity, named specific instances, and assigned the cause to the practice of spiritualism. Spiritualists jumped to defend the honor of their mediums and the practice of their faith. The public discussion of the unseemly details of Cora Hatch's conjugal relations drew tremendous sympathy from the spiritualist public. And we're going to attempt this one more time here. While the secular press applied the double standard of morality to Cora as they would to any woman who sought a divorce, the spiritualist press defended her action. The result of the marriage of a girl but 16 years of age, of pure benevolent disposition, with a man nearly threefold her years, of an avaricious, mercenary cast of character, has been long anticipated. Other mediums responded with trance lectures in Cora's support. Lizzie Doughton spoke in trance on the text, "Let he that is without sin among you cast the first stone." Without mentioning names, she blamed marital difficulties on the badly regulated love principle of errant husbands and urged that a woman of delicate nature, craving sympathy, who goes astray receives sympathy, not condemnation. Emma Hardinge responded with a trance lecture entitled Marriage, critical of the marriage laws which the Banner of Light declared the most able yet given about a subject on which so much happiness and misery depends. 12 years and 2 additional marriages later, Cora Hatch won praise for her divorce suit from women's rights advocate Paulina Wright Davis, who recalled that Cora practically protested false and unholy marriage because purity and harmony were necessities of her life. Spiritualists' critique of marriage and free love itself were part of the 19th century elevation of the roles of wife and mother and increased respect for the domestic sphere. Discussing the relations between free love and marriage, Alfred Cridge claimed, "We are free not because we have risen above marriage, but we have risen up to it." Once again, spiritualists pushed Victorian mores to their logical extreme. If marriage were indeed so sacred as 19th century moralists claimed, then it needed no legal sanction to regulate it. If motherhood were a sacred calling, it could not be entered into involuntarily. Spiritualists drew radical implications from domestic ideas. Late 19th century radicalism. Probably the 19th century figure most closely associated with free love is Victoria Woodhull. Her extreme anti-marriage position, however, was not typical of free love advocates. As Hale Sears has observed, her short-lived but widely publicized free love agitation in the early 1870s marked a watershed in the widespread discussion of sexual alternatives in 19th century America, after which the topic respectability greatly diminished. Within a few years, Woodhull fled to a respectable marriage in England, her third, and denied her earlier views. Yet the spiritualist sex radicals who had been discussing alternatives to traditional marriage for 20 years before Woodhull continued to do so for 20 years after her notoriety made the term free love almost unmentionable. Juliet Stillman Severance and fellow spiritualist J.H. Cook still wrote scientific articles on the number and duration of sex loves. In the 1880s, when few reformers not dedicated exclusively to sex radicalism would touch the subject. The serious attention paid by spiritualists as a group to the critique of marriage suggests that both men and women among them were dissatisfied with Oh, oh man, with sexual relations in the 19th century. One figure stands out among spiritualist lecturers who continued to agitate for the reform of marriage and sexuality long after entrenched Victorian values made their activities scandalous and sometimes illegal. Lois Wastebroecker was described by a contemporary as a she Abraham Lincoln, whose compelling oratory evoked the image of Sojourner Truth. Margaret Fuller and the actress Charlotte Cushman rolled into one. She described herself as an untitled spiritualist speaker devoted to the intertwined reforms of women's rights, free love, and spiritualism. Wastebroecker's personal history remains mysterious, but she had clearly experienced the economic and social liabilities of unmarried women. With no husband in evidence, she attempted to support her children by working as a domestic servant, but poverty and illness forced her to give them up to be raised by others. At the age of 26, she resolved to pursue her education and become a teacher in black schools before the Civil War, a task then as disreputable as was her future career as an advocate of spiritualism and free love. A brief second marriage when she was 30 convinced her of the immorality of the marriage laws. The content of Wastebroecker's public or prolific writings may provide clues to her biography. The seduction and betrayal of young women and the victimization of unwed mothers by the double standard constantly recur as themes in both her fiction and her nonfiction. Wastebroecker drew critical attention to the relation between the sexual and the economic exploitation of women in the sexual question and the money power, and in her account of a feminist utopia, sex revolution. If I am what I am told by those on the other side, then for this cause came I into the world to declare the truth as I see it. Wastebroecker wrote in the introduction to one of her books, "The truth, as Wastebroecker saw it, was that women were victimized by every aspect of contemporary morality. They suffered from the double standard that held them to stricter standards of behavior than men. They suffered from economic discrimination that forced them into loveless marriages, and they suffered from the belief that women were naturally passionless, and that the presence of sexual desire reflected a lack of virtue. Wastebroecker believed that women's emancipation required both the restraint of male passion and the release of female sexual impulses. Wastebroecker's attitude toward sexuality reflected her firm belief that the natural world, including natural human impulses, revealed the divine order of creation. Because desire was a natural property of human beings, she viewed it as good. Further, she insisted that each of us must accept our own sexuality in order to attain full self-respect, which she saw as an absolute requirement as a basis for a noble character. Because she believed all humans experience sexual desire, she saw society's negative attitudes towards sex as degrading to the self-images of all people. Women suffered most from this view because sexual desire was less acceptable in women than in men. I came to womanhood with the idea that purity was without desire, and when my own nature awoke, I despised myself because I could not subdue it, Wastebroecker quoted from one of the most conscientious women she knew. Wastebroecker's insistence that human sexuality must be accepted in order to allow for self-respect shows the distance spiritualism had traveled from the religious worldviews that preceded and surrounded it. Protestant orthodoxy asserted that salvation required a consciousness of oneself as inherently sinful by virtue of one's descent from Adam through the tainted process of sexual reproduction. In contrast, Weisbrucker believed that a conscientious of oneself is good, that a consciousness of oneself is good, including a consciousness of one's sexuality, was a prerequisite to moral character and behavior. Far from abandoning the contemporary elevation of femininity, Weisbrucker insisted that the true woman had sexual feelings and that her purity was compromised by society's insistence that she deny them. Is this light on? Yes, it is. Weisbrucker tied her free love views directly to her religious beliefs. She attributed her ability to cut through the dishonesty and deception of conventional morality to spiritualism's direct access to truth. As a spiritualist, she believed that she was no longer sitting in the shadow of reflected light, but clothed with the sun with direct power. In her book, The Occult Power of Sex, she argued that the magnetic forces that made spirit communication possible also powered the sex drive that drew individual men and women together. This same force was the source of religious enthusiasm. The yearnings of youth, Weisbrucker contended, could be satisfied either by sex or by religion, and it was because they knew this that the clergy attempted to control sexuality. Weisbrucker viewed her struggle to emancipate human beings from uncongenial marriages and sexual relations, and her struggle to emancipate souls from the dogma of conventional religion as one and the same. Weisbrucker was first arrested under the Comstock Anti-Obscenity Act in 1892. She was accused of printing obscene material in her Kansas newspaper, Foundation Principles, which expounded humanitarian spiritualism. The offending material consisted of an exchange between the editor and the male correspondent. The man described himself as uncongenially wed, middle-aged lawyer. He sought Weisbrucker's advice about his sexual relationship with the 30-year-old unmarried woman because the woman wanted to discontinue their affair. I love her dearly and do not want to do that which will cause her pain or regret. And yet we were made for each other and for no other, and we need that exchange of sexual vitality that can only be had by free and unrestricted intercourse. The correspondent proposed that he and his lover occasionally meet away from home for a day or two in order to enjoy the benefits of their sexual contact. He contended that our relations are and would be pure and right according to the true law of nature, and clearly hoped that Weisbrucker would affirm his view and support the continuation of his relationship. Weisbrucker reprinted the letter in full in order to vent her opposition to the views of its author and of those who think we are demanding freedom that we may revel in sensual pleasure. Instead of supporting the writer's call for freedom, she condemned his hypocrisy for remaining in a loveless marriage and seeking secret sex outside it. Was it the matter, my good sir? What is the matter, my good sir, that you cannot adjust conditions so that you can fearlessly and openly take your loved one by the hand in the face of the world? She castigated him for wanting to secure the pleasure without the risk by continuing the clandestine affair. Should exposure follow you, a man can stand it, but where would she be in the eyes of the community? Do you love her and yet would subject her through her love for you to such a risk? If you cannot stand by her now, you could not then. Weisbrucker, women's rights. What's that? Exactly. Weisbrucker saw the source of her correspondent's dilemma not in the social sanctions against extramarital sex, but rather in his willingness to remain in a loveless marriage. As a solution, she prescribed the dissolution of his false marriage, which would free him to follow his heart. She attributed his problem not to his lover's unwillingness to continue their affair in secret, but to his own moral weakness for being unwilling to brave social ostracism and seek a divorce. Her solution moved the onus of loyalty to reform principles off the woman's shoulders and placed it squarely on those of her married lover. Lois Wastebrook's views illustrate the possible differences between men's and women's understandings of free love. The correspondent subscribed to Wastebrook's paper and read her writings, but used the concepts he found there to support the traditional double standard of morality that allowed men to seek sexual alliances outside marriage without risking the social respectability of the married state. Wastebrook's response criticized both the inconsistency of the lawyer's position with free love principles and his sexism in wanting to subject his female partner to risk he himself was not willing to assume. For many male proponents, the attraction of free love lay in its promise of freer sexual contact. For women, the doctrine might more accurately be defined as freedom not to love, except in very limited circumstances in which they exercise complete control of their own actions. Spiritualists' willingness to enter the citadel of marriage and criticize society's more dearly held beliefs exacted stiff penalties from the advocates of free love. For Lois Wastebrook, the price was repeated arrests, culminating in her prosecution at the age of 76 for publishing an article condemning the awful fate of fallen women, which a Washington state court judged obscene in 1902. Free love could exact a more personal toll from a woman whose husband's interpretation of the doctrine differed from her own. Mary Fenn Davis ultimately fell victim to the same principles that liberated her from a loveless marriage years before. In 1885, her husband and co-worker, Andrew Jackson Davis, informed her that he had misinterpreted the spirit message of 30 years ago and that she was not, in fact, his spiritual affinity. Jesus Christ. His true affinity had appeared in a young woman who was his fellow student at the United States Medical College in New York. The announcement cost the founder of the harmonial philosophy much of his reputation in reform circles, where his wife was as highly esteemed as he. But the 60-year-old Mary Fenn Davis, true to her principles, received the news with apparent equanimity and did not fight the ensuing divorce. However, she went into a physical decline from which she never recovered. She assumed her mother's maiden name, Fenn, and died a year and a half later. That son of a bitch. Well, why would you ever trust a guy who uses his middle name in his name? Anyway, that's the end of chapter 5. The next one is mediums versus medical men. Boo! All right, bros, that's all. I think.